The lights of the courthouse bathroom buzzed overhead as 24-year-old Precious Klein stared at her reflection in the scratched mirror. Dark circles shadowed her brown eyes, and her usually lustrous black hair hung limp around her shoulders. In 3 minutes, she would walk into Family Courtroom B and face the most important battle of her young life, a fight for the right to raise her own daughter without interference from a woman who believed she knew better than medical professionals, better than therapists, and certainly better than Precious herself. The irony wasn't lost on her. 6 months ago, she had been celebrating her first Mother's Day, holding 3-month-old Ruby in her arms, while her husband, Marcus, took photos in their small apartment in Portland, Oregon. Now, she was preparing to defend her parenting decisions to a judge because her mother-in-law, Eleanor Klein, had weaponized the most vulnerable period of Precious's life against her. But this story doesn't begin in a courthouse bathroom. It begins in the quiet suburbs of Beaverton, Oregon, where Precious thought she had found the perfect life, before she learned that sometimes the people who claim to love you most are the ones who can hurt you deepest.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Precious Martinez had always been drawn to quiet, predictable lives. Growing up as the youngest of 4 children in a chaotic household in East Portland, she craved stability the way some people craved adventure. Her parents, Maria and Roberto Martinez, worked multiple jobs to keep their family afloat. Her mother cleaned office buildings at night, her father drove delivery trucks during the day. Love was abundant in the Martinez household, but privacy and peace were rare commodities. So, when Precious met Marcus Klein during her junior year at Portland State University, she was immediately attracted to the calm that seemed to surround him. Marcus came from what appeared to be the opposite world, a middle-class family in Beaverton with a stay-at-home mother who baked cookies for school fundraisers and a father who coached Little League on weekends. The Klein house on Maple Street was everything Precious had dreamed of, organized, quiet, and predictably routine. "My mom's going to love you," Marcus had told her after their third date as they walked through Laurelhurst Park on a crisp October evening. He was studying business administration, planning to take over his father's small accounting firm someday. Precious was majoring in early childhood education, drawn to working with children because of her natural patience and nurturing instincts, qualities that had helped her care for her younger siblings when her parents were working. When Marcus first brought Precious home for dinner, Eleanor Klein seemed to embody everything Precious had imagined about having a real mother. Eleanor was 52, with perfectly styled silver hair and a wardrobe of coordinated cardigans and slacks. Her kitchen always smelled like vanilla and cinnamon, and she had a way of asking questions that made you feel like she genuinely cared about your answers. "Tell me about your family, dear," Eleanor had said that first evening, serving Precious a slice of homemade apple pie. "Marcus mentioned your parents work very hard." Precious had felt a flush of pride mixed with slight embarrassment. "Yes, they do. My mom works nights, and my dad drives for a logistics company. They've always made sure we had what we needed." "How admirable," Eleanor had responded. But there was something in her tone, a subtle inflection that Precious couldn't quite identify, that made her feel like she was being evaluated rather than welcomed. Still, as months passed and her relationship with Marcus deepened, Precious found herself spending more and more time at the Klein house. Eleanor would invite her to join their family traditions, Sunday dinners, holiday preparations, even grocery shopping trips where she would offer advice about meal planning and budgeting. For someone who had grown up sharing a bedroom with 2 sisters and rarely experiencing a quiet moment, the Klein family's structured, peaceful lifestyle felt like stepping into a different world. "You're so lucky," her best friend Carmen had told her one afternoon as they studied together at the campus library. "Having a future mother-in-law who actually wants to spend time with you. My boyfriend's mom acts like I'm stealing her precious son." Precious had nodded, but even then, something nagged at her. Eleanor's attention sometimes felt less like genuine affection and more like gentle surveillance. She would ask detailed questions about Precious's classes, her family's activities, even her menstrual cycle when she learned that Precious occasionally experienced severe cramps. "You might want to see a doctor about that, dear," Eleanor had suggested during one of their shopping trips. "There are medications that can help. You want to make sure everything is working properly for when you and Marcus decide to have children." The comment had struck Precious as oddly presumptuous. She and Marcus had been dating for less than a year, but she had attributed it to Eleanor's caring nature. After all, her own mother had never had time for such detailed conversations about health and wellness. When Marcus proposed during their senior year, Eleanor had immediately thrown herself into wedding planning with an enthusiasm that both touched and overwhelmed Precious. She had opinions about everything: the venue, the flowers, the guest list, even Precious's choice of wedding dress. "I think something more traditional would photograph better," Eleanor had suggested when she showed her the sleek, simple gown she had chosen. "Remember, these photos will be in the family for generations." Precious had eventually changed her dress choice, telling herself that Eleanor's experience and refined taste were valuable assets. Her own mother, working 2 jobs and caring for Precious's elderly grandmother, had little time to focus on wedding details. The wedding itself, held at a small church in Beaverton, had been beautiful and exactly what Eleanor had envisioned. Precious's family had seemed slightly overwhelmed by the formal atmosphere, but they had tried their best to blend in with the Klein family's friends and relatives. During the reception, Precious had noticed her mother standing alone by the gift table, looking uncomfortable in her borrowed dress, while Eleanor moved through the crowd like a seasoned hostess, introducing herself to Precious's relatives and asking pointed questions about their jobs and living situations.
"Your family seems very authentic," Eleanor had told Precious during a quiet moment at the reception. "I can see where you get your down-to-earth nature." Again, that subtle tone that made the compliment feel somehow backhanded, but Precious had pushed the feeling aside. This was her wedding day, and Eleanor had worked hard to make it perfect. After the honeymoon, a modest trip to the Oregon coast that Eleanor had helped plan and partly funded, Marcus and Precious had settled into a small apartment in southeast Portland. It was all they could afford on Marcus's entry-level salary at his father's firm and Precious's income as a preschool teacher's aide, but it felt like their own little sanctuary. For the first year of marriage, life had been blissfully routine. Marcus would leave for work each morning. Precious would head to the preschool where she worked with 3- and 4-year-olds, and in the evenings they would cook simple dinners together while planning their future. They talked about buying a house someday, maybe having children in a few years, taking a real vacation to somewhere beyond the Pacific Northwest. Eleanor called several times a week and visited every Sunday for dinner, always bringing a homemade dessert and usually a small gift. New kitchen towels, a book she thought Precious might enjoy, or supplements she had read about in one of her health magazines. "You need to make sure you're taking care of yourself," she would say, pressing a bottle of vitamins into Precious's hands. "You're still so young, and you want to be in the best health possible when you're ready to give Marcus children." The constant focus on future children had begun to feel uncomfortable, but Precious had assumed it was normal for a mother-in-law to look forward to grandchildren. Her own mother, overwhelmed with her current responsibilities, rarely discussed Precious's future plans beyond hoping she was happy. When Precious discovered she was pregnant in the spring, just 2 months after her 23rd birthday, Eleanor's reaction had been immediate and intense. "Oh, this is wonderful news," she had exclaimed when Marcus called to tell his parents. "I'm going to be such a hands-on grandmother. We need to start planning everything right away." Within days, Eleanor had arrived at their apartment with pregnancy books, prenatal vitamin samples, and a list of recommended doctors. She had opinions about everything from Precious's diet to her exercise routine to her work schedule. "You really shouldn't be lifting those heavy children at the preschool," Eleanor had insisted. "It's not safe in your condition. Maybe you should consider taking some time off." Precious had explained that she couldn't afford to stop working and that her job actually involved very little heavy lifting, but Eleanor had persisted in her concerns. She began calling daily to check on Precious's symptoms, her eating habits, and her energy levels.
I just want to make sure you're both healthy, Eleanor would say when Precious gently suggested that the daily check-ins weren't necessary. This is such an important time, and I have experience with these things. As Precious's pregnancy progressed, Eleanor's involvement had intensified. She attended doctor's appointments when Marcus couldn't make it, asked detailed questions about test results, and researched every symptom Precious experienced. She had strong opinions about the birth plan, the nursery setup, and even potential baby names. I think family names are so important, Eleanor had suggested when Precious and Marcus discussed their preferences. Marcus's grandfather was named Robert. It's such a strong traditional name. When they had ultimately chosen to name their daughter Ruby, Eleanor had seemed disappointed, but had quickly pivoted to focusing on middle names and nickname options. Throughout the pregnancy, Precious had felt increasingly like a vessel being carefully monitored, rather than a woman experiencing her own journey to motherhood. But everyone around her, Marcus, her own family, their friends, seemed to view Eleanor's intense involvement as wonderfully supportive. "You're so lucky to have a mother-in-law who cares so much," her coworker Janet had said during Precious's baby shower, which Eleanor had organized down to the smallest detail. Most women complain that their husbands' mothers are too distant. Ruby Klein had been born on a snowy February morning after 18 hours of labor. She was healthy, beautiful, and perfect in every way that mattered. But as Precious held her daughter for the first time, she had felt an unexpected wave of protectiveness that seemed to extend beyond the normal maternal instincts she had expected. When Eleanor had rushed into the hospital room just hours after the birth, armed with flowers, balloons, and a list of visitors she had already coordinated, Precious had felt her first real resistance. "Maybe we should wait a day or two before having too many people visit," Precious had suggested weakly, still exhausted from labor and overwhelmed by the intensity of new motherhood. "Nonsense," Eleanor had replied briskly, already rearranging the flowers and adjusting the window blinds. "Everyone is so excited to meet her, and you need to start getting used to having help. New mothers who try to do everything alone often struggle unnecessarily." That comment would prove to be prophetic in ways that Eleanor had never intended. Because in the weeks that followed, as Precious navigated the challenging terrain of new motherhood, she would discover that sometimes the line between help and control is thinner than anyone realizes, and that the people who claim to want what's best for you don't always understand what that actually means.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The first sign that something was wrong came 3 weeks after Ruby's birth, on a gray March morning when the Portland rain seemed to echo the heaviness that had settled in Precious's chest. She sat in the nursery rocker, holding Ruby, who had been crying inconsolably for 2 hours, and felt a terror she had never experienced before. Not fear of something external, but fear of herself. "I don't think I'm doing this right," she whispered to Marcus as he rushed around the apartment, getting ready for work. His paternity leave had ended the week before, and suddenly Precious found herself alone with Ruby for 10 hours a day, while Eleanor's daily visits had extended from an hour to most of the afternoon. "You're doing great, babe," Marcus had said, kissing the top of her head while grabbing his coffee. "Mom says it's totally normal to feel overwhelmed the first few weeks. She'll be here at 9 to help." But that was exactly the problem. Eleanor's help had begun to feel suffocating. She had a way of taking over feeding times, suggesting that Precious wasn't holding Ruby correctly, and making comments about the apartment's cleanliness that left Precious feeling inadequate and scrutinized. New mothers need structure, Eleanor had announced the previous week, arriving with a detailed daily schedule she had printed out. Ruby should be eating every 3 hours, napping at specific times, and you need to establish routines now or she'll never learn proper habits. When Precious had tried to explain that Ruby seemed to have her own natural rhythms that didn't match Eleanor's schedule, Eleanor had frowned with what looked like concern mixed with disappointment. "Precious dear, I raised 3 children successfully." Sometimes new mothers think they know better than experience, but babies need consistency. You can't just wing it. The comment had stung because it contained enough truth to be believable. Precious was winging it, learning as she went, making mistakes and trying to trust her instincts. But Eleanor's rigid approach felt wrong for Ruby, who seemed to thrive on flexibility and responded better to being held and comforted than to strict scheduling. More troubling was how Eleanor had begun discussing Precious's emotional state with Marcus as if she weren't in the room. "I'm concerned about her mood," Eleanor had told Marcus one evening while Precious was in the kitchen preparing dinner. "She seems very emotional, and she's not following the feeding schedule we discussed. I think she might be developing some postpartum issues." Precious had frozen at the sink, realizing that Eleanor was treating her like a patient rather than a daughter-in-law. When she had tried to address it later with Marcus, he had been dismissive. "She's just trying to help, Precious. She knows what she's talking about. Maybe you should consider seeing someone if you're feeling overwhelmed." That suggestion had planted a seed of doubt that grew over the following weeks. Was she struggling more than normal? Were her feelings of frustration with Eleanor's interference actually signs of something wrong with her? The catalyst moment came on a rainy Thursday in late March. Precious had been up most of the night with Ruby, who seemed to be going through a growth spurt and wanted to nurse constantly. She was exhausted, wearing the same pajamas she had slept in, and had been looking forward to a quiet morning to rest when Ruby napped. Instead, Eleanor had arrived at 8:30 a.m. with coffee and pastries, letting herself in with the key Marcus had given her for emergencies. "Oh my goodness, you look terrible," Eleanor had announced upon seeing Precious. "Have you been up all night again? This isn't sustainable, dear. You need to let Ruby cry it out sometimes, or she'll never learn independence." Precious had tried to explain that Ruby was cluster feeding, a completely normal behavior for breastfeeding babies, but Eleanor had interrupted with a lecture about the importance of not spoiling infants. "In my day, we didn't pick up babies every time they fussed. That's why Marcus and his brothers were such good sleepers. You're creating bad habits that will be very hard to break." The conversation had continued in this vein for an hour, with Eleanor criticizing everything from the temperature of the apartment to the way Precious was burping Ruby. Finally, when Ruby had started crying again, Eleanor had reached for her without asking. "Let me show you the proper way to calm her down," Eleanor had said, taking Ruby from Precious's arms and beginning to bounce her in a way that made Ruby cry harder. "She needs to nurse," Precious had said, reaching for her daughter. "She's hungry. She just ate an hour ago. She's being fussy because you're not establishing proper boundaries. Sometimes babies need to learn that crying doesn't always get them what they want." In that moment, something had snapped inside Precious. The exhaustion, the constant criticism, the feeling of being treated like an incompetent child in her own home. It all crystallized into a moment of absolute clarity. "Give me my daughter," Precious had said, her voice steady but firm in a way that surprised them both. Eleanor had looked startled. "Precious, I'm just trying to help." "I said, give me my daughter, now."
The silence that followed was electric. Eleanor had slowly handed Ruby back to Precious, her expression shifting from surprise to something that looked almost like calculation. "I think you're having some emotional difficulties," Eleanor had said carefully. "This kind of aggression toward people who are trying to help you isn't normal for new mothers. I think we need to discuss this with Marcus." "I'm not being aggressive," Precious had replied, settling Ruby at her breast where the baby immediately calmed. "I'm being a mother, and I don't need your permission to feed my own child." Eleanor had gathered her purse and coat with deliberate movements. "I think you need some time to think about your priorities, dear. When you're ready to accept help gracefully, I'll be here, but I won't be treated rudely in exchange for trying to support my son's family." After Eleanor left, Precious had sat in the quiet apartment, nursing Ruby and feeling something she hadn't experienced in months. Peace. Ruby had fallen asleep contentedly, and for the first time since bringing her daughter home, Precious had felt like she might actually know what she was doing. But that evening, Marcus had come home with a concerned expression that told Precious Eleanor had already shared her version of the day's events. "Mom says you were really upset today," Marcus had said, sitting beside her on the couch where she was reading while Ruby slept in her bassinet. "She's worried about you, and honestly, so am I. You've seemed really on edge lately." "I'm not on edge," Precious had replied. "I'm tired and I'm learning how to be a mother. Your mother's constant criticism isn't helping." "She's not criticizing you. She's trying to share her experience. There's a difference." The conversation had escalated from there, with Marcus defending his mother's intentions, while Precious tried to explain how Eleanor's help felt more like micromanagement. It was their first real fight since Ruby's birth, and it ended with Marcus sleeping on the couch and Precious lying awake wondering if she was losing her mind. Over the next few days, Eleanor's visits had stopped completely. At first, Precious had felt relief, but as the silence stretched on, she began to second-guess herself. Maybe she had overreacted. Maybe Eleanor really was just trying to help, and Precious's exhaustion had made her unreasonably defensive. When Eleanor finally called a week later, her tone was different, more cooler, more formal. "Marcus asked me to check on you," she had said. "He's concerned about your emotional state, and frankly, so am I. Have you considered seeing someone about postpartum depression? There are medications that can help." The suggestion had felt like both a lifeline and a trap. Precious had been struggling with mood swings, crying spells, and a general feeling of being overwhelmed. Maybe medication would help. But there was something about the way Eleanor had suggested it, as if Precious's resistance to her interference was a symptom, rather than a reasonable response. "I'll think about it," Precious had said. "I've already researched some doctors for you," Eleanor had continued. "Dr. Jennifer Walsh has excellent reviews, and she specializes in postpartum issues. I can make an appointment if you'd like." The speed with which Eleanor had produced this information suggested she had been planning this conversation for some time, but Precious was too tired to analyze the implications. If medication could help her feel more like herself, maybe it was worth considering. The appointment with Dr. Walsh had been scheduled for the following week, and in the meantime, Eleanor had resumed her visits, but with a different energy. She was overly solicitous, speaking to Precious in the careful tone people use with someone they consider fragile. "How are you feeling today, dear?" Eleanor would ask, studying Precious's face as if looking for symptoms. "You know, untreated postpartum depression can have serious consequences for both mother and baby." These comments had a way of making Precious feel worse, not better. She began to question every emotion, every moment of frustration or sadness. Was this normal new mother adjustment, or was she developing a serious mental health condition? The night before her appointment with Dr. Walsh, Precious had stood in her Ruby's nursery, watching her daughter sleep, and felt a moment of perfect clarity. Ruby was healthy, growing, and obviously loved. Precious was tired and adjusting to motherhood, but she was bonding with her daughter and learning to navigate this new role. The problem wasn't her mental health. It was the constant message that she was failing, that she needed fixing, that her natural responses to motherhood were symptoms of illness. But by then, Eleanor had already set forces in motion that would prove impossible to stop. The appointment was scheduled, Marcus was convinced that Precious needed professional help, and Eleanor had positioned herself as the concerned family member who was trying to save both Precious and Ruby from the consequences of untreated mental illness. As Precious stood in that nursery, she had no way of knowing that Eleanor was already researching grandparents' rights in Oregon, or that her decision about medication would be carefully documented and later used against her. She only knew that something fundamental had shifted in her relationship with her husband's family, and that the battle lines were being drawn around her fitness as a mother. The catalyst moment hadn't been a single event, but a series of small power struggles that had revealed the true nature of Eleanor's involvement in their lives. What Precious had initially seen as generous support, she now recognized as a systematic campaign to undermine her confidence and establish Eleanor as the primary decision-maker in Ruby's life.
The appointment with Dr. Walsh would prove to be the next crucial moment in this unfolding drama, but Precious approached it with a new awareness of what was really at stake. This wasn't just about her mental health or her relationship with Eleanor. This was about who would have the power to make decisions about Ruby's future, and Precious was finally ready to fight for that right.
Dr. Jennifer Walsh's office was exactly what Precious had expected. Soft beige walls, comfortable chairs arranged at careful angles, and the kind of abstract art that was designed to be soothing without being distracting. What she hadn't expected was how young Dr. Walsh looked, probably only a few years older than Precious herself, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that immediately put her at ease. "Tell me what brought you here today," Dr. Walsh had said after the initial paperwork was complete. She didn't have a notepad or clipboard, just her full attention focused on Precious in a way that felt refreshingly different from Eleanor's constant monitoring. Precious had prepared herself to discuss postpartum depression symptoms, but instead found herself talking about Eleanor. "My mother-in-law thinks I'm not handling motherhood well," she began, then paused, surprised by her own words. "I mean, I am struggling with some things. New motherhood is harder than I expected, but I'm not sure if what I'm experiencing is depression or just normal adjustment to having a baby." Dr. Walsh had nodded encouragingly. "Can you tell me more about what not handling it well looks like to your mother-in-law?" As Precious described the constant criticism, the undermining of her instincts, and the recent confrontation over feeding Ruby, she watched Dr. Walsh's expression carefully. There was no judgment there, no suggestion that Precious was overreacting or being too sensitive. "How do you feel when you're alone with Ruby?" Precious answered immediately, then felt surprised by the certainty in her voice. "Happy. Tired, definitely. Sometimes overwhelmed by how much she needs me, but when it's just us, I feel like I know what I'm doing, like we understand each other. And when your mother-in-law is present? Like I'm failing at everything, like Ruby would be better off with someone more experienced." Precious paused, considering, but that feeling only happens when Eleanor is there, commenting on everything I do. Dr. Walsh had leaned back in her chair, and she could see her processing this information. "Precious, based on what you're telling me, you don't sound like someone suffering from postpartum depression. You sound like someone whose confidence is being systematically undermined by external criticism." The relief that flooded through Precious was so intense it brought tears to her eyes. For weeks, she had been questioning her own perceptions, wondering if her frustration with Eleanor was really a symptom of mental illness. "But I do have bad days," Precious said, wanting to be completely honest. "Days when I cry for no reason, or when I feel angry about small things. That's completely normal for someone adjusting to new motherhood, especially someone who's sleep-deprived and dealing with major life changes. The question is, do these feelings interfere with your ability to care for Ruby or take care of yourself? Do you have thoughts of harming yourself or your baby?" "Never," Precious said firmly. "I love Ruby more than I've ever loved anything. Even on my worst days, I never doubt that." Dr. Walsh had smiled then, the first time during their session. "That tells me everything I need to know about your mental health. A mother with postpartum depression typically struggles to bond with her baby, feels disconnected from the child, or experiences intrusive thoughts about harm. You're describing the opposite, a strong maternal bond being threatened by outside interference." The session had continued for another 30 minutes, during which Dr. Walsh helped Precious identify the difference between normal postpartum adjustment and clinical depression. She explained that some new mothers do benefit from medication, but that medication should never be prescribed just to make someone more compliant with others' expectations. "Your instincts about Ruby sound very healthy," Dr. Walsh had concluded. "Trust them, and be very wary of anyone who suggests that your natural protective responses are pathological." As Precious left the appointment, she felt something she hadn't experienced in weeks: validation. A medical professional had listened to her concerns and confirmed what she had suspected. She wasn't sick, she was being manipulated. But when she returned home and told Marcus about the appointment, his response revealed how deep Eleanor's influence had become. "So she didn't prescribe anything?"
Marcus asked, looking disappointed. Mom was hoping the medication would help you feel more balanced. Marcus, I don't need medication. Dr. Walsh said I don't have postpartum depression. She said what I'm experiencing is normal adjustment, complicated by external stress. External stress? You mean my mother trying to help us? The conversation had quickly devolved into another argument, with Marcus insisting that Dr. Walsh was too young and inexperienced to make such a diagnosis, and Precious realizing that her husband had already decided she was mentally ill before she'd even seen the doctor. That evening, while Marcus was giving Ruby a bath, Precious called her own mother for the first time since Ruby's birth without Eleanor listening in or Marcus monitoring the conversation. Mija, you sound different. Stronger, maybe, Maria Martinez said after they had talked for a few minutes. I saw a doctor today about postpartum depression, but she said I'm fine, that what I'm going through is normal.
Of course you're fine, her mother replied with a laugh. You think I didn't struggle when you were born? You think your grandmother didn't have hard days? New motherhood is difficult, but that doesn't mean you're broken. The simplicity of her mother's response was like a balm. In her family, struggles were acknowledged but not pathologized. Difficulties were temporary challenges to be worked through, not permanent defects to be medicated away. Marcus's mother thinks I need help, Precious said carefully. There was a long pause before her mother responded. That woman has been circling you like a hawk since the day you met Marcus. I've been waiting for you to notice. The observation hit Precious like a physical blow. Her own family had seen what she had been too trusting to recognize, that Eleanor's attention had never been about support, but about control. Over the following days, Precious began to see her situation with new clarity. She started keeping a mental record of Eleanor's comments and suggestions, recognizing patterns she had previously missed. Eleanor consistently undermined Precious's decisions while positioning herself as the knowledgeable expert. She created problems where none existed, then offered herself as the solution. Most importantly, she had convinced Marcus that any resistance to her involvement was a sign of Precious's mental instability. The awakening fully crystallized during Eleanor's next visit, 3 days after the appointment with Dr. Walsh. Eleanor arrived with a casserole and a stack of printouts about postpartum depression medications. I've been researching options for you, dear, Eleanor announced, spreading the papers across Precious's kitchen table. There are several medications that are safe for breastfeeding mothers, and I think we should discuss them with Dr. Walsh. We? Precious asked, focusing on the pronoun. Well, I want to be involved in your treatment planning. After all, Ruby's well-being depends on your mental health, and I have a responsibility as her grandmother to make sure she's in a safe environment. The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Eleanor was positioning Precious's refusal to take medication as evidence that Ruby might not be safe in her care. Eleanor, Precious said, her voice calm but firm, Dr. Walsh said I don't have postpartum depression. She said I don't need medication. Eleanor's expression shifted to what Precious now recognized as calculated concern. Sweetheart, denial is very common with postpartum mental health issues. Many mothers don't recognize their own symptoms. That's why family members need to step in and advocate for proper treatment. I'm not in denial. I had a thorough evaluation with a licensed psychiatrist who specializes in postpartum mental health. She confirmed that I'm experiencing normal adjustment challenges, not clinical depression. One appointment isn't really enough for a proper diagnosis, Eleanor replied, her tone becoming more patronizing. I think we need to get a second opinion. I've already researched Dr. Patricia Monroe. She's been practicing for 25 years and has excellent reviews for treating postpartum disorders. The realization that Eleanor had already been planning alternative doctors while Precious was still seeing Dr. Walsh was like a missing puzzle piece clicking into place. This had never been about Precious's well-being. This was a systematic campaign to establish that Precious was mentally unfit to make decisions about Ruby's care. I won't be seeing Dr. Monroe. I'm satisfied with Dr. Walsh's assessment, and I won't be taking medication I don't need. Eleanor's mask slipped slightly, revealing a flash of anger before she composed herself. Precious, I hope you understand that refusing treatment when you clearly need help could have serious consequences. If something were to happen to Ruby because you weren't willing to address your mental health issues? The threat was no longer subtle.
Eleanor was making it clear that Precious's refusal to accept her version of reality would be used as evidence against her. That night, after Eleanor left and Marcus went to bed early claiming a headache, Precious sat in Ruby's nursery, nursing her daughter and thinking about everything that had led to this moment. The baby looked up at her with dark, trusting eyes, and Precious felt a surge of protective fury she had never experienced before. She understood now that this wasn't really about postpartum depression or medication, or even Eleanor's controlling personality. This was about power, specifically the power to determine what was best for Ruby. Eleanor had spent months positioning herself as the expert on child rearing while systematically undermining Precious's confidence. She had recruited Marcus to her side by framing Precious's natural responses as symptoms of illness. Now she was using medical authority to validate her belief that Precious was unfit to make decisions about her own child. But Eleanor had made one crucial mistake. She had pushed Precious to see Dr. Walsh, expecting the doctor to confirm her diagnosis. Instead, Dr. Walsh had validated Precious's perceptions and given her the professional backing she needed to trust her own instincts. As Ruby fell asleep in her arms, Precious made a decision that would change everything. She would not be taking medication she didn't need to placate Eleanor's need for control. She would not be allowing Eleanor to undermine her parenting decisions under the guise of medical necessity, and she would not be pretending that Eleanor's behavior was normal or acceptable just to keep peace in the family. The awakening was complete. Precious now understood that she was in a battle for the right to raise her own daughter, and she was finally ready to fight. She had professional validation of her mental health, a clear understanding of Eleanor's tactics, and most importantly, an unshakable certainty about her love for Ruby and her ability to be the mother her daughter needed. What she didn't yet know was how far Eleanor was prepared to go to maintain control, and that her decision to refuse medication would soon become the centerpiece of a legal battle that would test everything she thought she knew about family, loyalty, and the American justice system.
The first step was the hardest. Setting boundaries with someone who had never encountered them before. The morning after her awakening, Precious woke with a sense of purpose that felt both empowering and terrifying. Ruby had slept for a solid 4-hour stretch, the longest since her birth, as if sensing her mother's newfound resolve. When Eleanor called at 8:30 a.m. to announce she was coming over to check on things, Precious took a deep breath and said the words she had never spoken to her mother-in-law before. "Actually, Eleanor, today isn't good for a visit. I need some space to bond with Ruby without interruption." The silence on the other end of the phone stretched so long that Precious wondered if the call had dropped. "I'm sorry, what did you say?" Eleanor's voice was carefully controlled, but Precious could hear the shock underneath. "I said today isn't good for a visit. I'll call you when I'm ready for company." "Precious, honey, I think you're having one of those episodes Dr. Walsh mentioned. New mothers sometimes become irrationally protective and push away the people trying to help them. This is exactly why you need medication." The speed with which Eleanor pivoted to medical authority was breathtaking. But Precious was prepared now. Dr. Walsh didn't mention any episodes. She said I'm mentally healthy and should trust my instincts. My instinct is that I need time alone with my daughter. Another silence. Then Eleanor's tone shifted to something Precious had never heard before. Cold steel wrapped in false concern. "I see. Well, I suppose I'll have to discuss this development with Marcus. I hope you understand that your behavior is being noted, dear." The threat was crystal clear, but instead of the usual anxiety it would have provoked, Precious felt a strange sense of relief. Eleanor had finally dropped her loving grandmother mask and revealed what this had always been about: power and control, with detailed documentation of Precious's failures as ammunition. But implementing boundaries proved more complicated than simply stating them. When Marcus came home that evening, he was angry in a way Precious had rarely seen. "My mother called me at work crying. She said you were rude to her and refused to let her see Ruby. What's gotten into you?" "Nothing's gotten into me. I told her I needed a day without visitors. That's not unreasonable for a new mother." It is when the visitor is Ruby's grandmother who's been helping us every day since she was born. Mom thinks you're having some kind of breakdown. Precious set down the baby bottle she'd been washing and turned to face her husband fully. Marcus, do you think I'm having a breakdown? The question seemed to catch him off guard. I don't know. You've been different lately. More defensive, more emotional. Mom says those are warning signs. Look at me right now. Do I seem unstable to you? Do I seem like I'm not capable of caring for our daughter? Marcus studied her face, and for a moment, Precious saw doubt flicker in his eyes. Not doubt about her, but doubt about the narrative he'd been accepting. You seem, I don't know, angry, I guess. I am angry. I'm angry that your mother treats me like an incompetent child. I'm angry that she questions every decision I make about my own daughter. And I'm angry that you automatically take her side instead of supporting your wife. The conversation that followed was their most honest since Ruby's birth, but also their most painful. Marcus revealed that Eleanor had been expressing concerns about Precious's fitness as a mother since the hospital, documenting incidents of concerning behavior that Precious had been completely unaware of. Like what incidents? Precious asked. Like how you cried when Ruby wouldn't stop fussing that first week, and how you got upset when Mom suggested a different swaddling technique. She said you seemed overly possessive and resistant to guidance. Precious stared at her husband in disbelief. Marcus, I cried because I was exhausted and learning to be a mother. I got upset because your mother criticized everything I did. Those aren't symptoms. They're normal human reactions. But what if they're not? What if Mom is right and you can't see it because you're too close to the situation? The betrayal in that question cut deeper than anything Eleanor had done. This was her husband, the man who was supposed to know her better than anyone, suggesting that her reality might not be trustworthy. If you really believe I'm mentally unfit to care for our daughter, then we have bigger problems than your mother's interference, Precious said quietly. That night, they slept on opposite sides of their bed, a chasm of mistrust between them that hadn't existed before Eleanor began her campaign. The next few days brought a series of small battles as Precious tried to establish her authority as Ruby's mother, while Eleanor pushed back through Marcus and increasingly direct confrontations. When Eleanor arrived unannounced the following afternoon, Precious didn't let her in. I'm not having visitors today, she said through the closed door. Precious, open this door right now. I have every right to see my granddaughter. You have the right I give you. And today, I'm not giving it. Eleanor's voice turned sharp. This is exactly the kind of concerning behavior I've been documenting. Marcus will hear about this. The word documenting sent a chill through Precious. It suggested a level of planning and preparation that went beyond a concerned grandmother's worry. When Marcus came home and found his mother sitting in her car outside their apartment building, the fight that ensued was explosive. She wouldn't let me see Ruby, she told him, tears streaming down her face in a performance worthy of an Oscar. I'm so worried about both of them. I think Ruby might not be safe. Safe from what? Precious demanded, joining them in the parking lot with Ruby in her carrier. From your increasingly erratic behavior, Eleanor replied, her voice taking on the clinical tone she used when discussing Precious's supposed mental health issues. Isolating yourself and the baby, refusing help, becoming paranoid about family members who love you, these are all red flags for postpartum psychosis. The escalation from depression to psychosis was so dramatic, it would have been laughable if it weren't for so terrifying. Eleanor was systematically raising the stakes, making Precious's mental health sound more dangerous with each accusation.
I'm not isolating anyone, Precious said, struggling to keep her voice level. I'm establishing healthy boundaries. There's a difference. Not according to the research I've done, Eleanor replied, pulling out her phone to show printed articles. I've been in touch with several experts about your symptoms, and they're very concerned. The revelation that Eleanor had been discussing Precious's private life with strangers was the final straw. What experts? What right do you have to share personal information about me with anyone? I have the right of a concerned family member who's worried about her granddaughter's safety. If you won't seek help voluntarily, someone needs to advocate for Ruby. The threat was no longer veiled. Eleanor was making it clear that she was building a case against Precious's fitness as a mother, complete with expert opinions and documented evidence of concerning behavior. Marcus stood between the two women, looking torn and overwhelmed. "Maybe we should all take a step back," he suggested weakly. "There's no stepping back from this, Marcus," Eleanor said firmly. "Your wife is showing clear signs of mental instability, and she's refusing treatment. We have to think about what's best for Ruby." That night, after Eleanor left and Marcus retreated to his computer to research postpartum mental health issues, Precious called her sister Carmen, who was a social worker in Salem. "Carmen, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. If someone wanted to challenge a mother's custody of her baby, what would they need to prove?" "That's a serious question, Precious. Are you in some kind of trouble?" Precious explained the situation, and Carmen listened without interrupting until she was finished. "Okay, first of all, you need to document everything Eleanor says and does from now on. Keep a journal with dates and times. Second, you need to understand that in Oregon, grandparents can petition for custody if they can prove the parents are unfit, but the burden of proof is very high. What would constitute proof of unfitness? Severe mental illness that interferes with parenting ability, documented neglect or abuse, drug or alcohol addiction, serious stuff. But here's the thing, Precious. Refusing medication for a condition you don't have isn't proof of anything except good judgment." Carmen's professional perspective was reassuring, but she also warned Precious about the realities of family court. Even if Eleanor can't prove unfitness, she might still be able to get visitation rights if she can show that Ruby's best interests would be served by maintaining a relationship with her grandmother. And if Marcus supports her petition? The implication hung in the air. Precious's own husband might testify against her. Over the following weeks, the pattern became clear. Eleanor would create a situation designed to provoke a reaction from Precious, then document that reaction as evidence of instability. She would arrive unannounced and act hurt when not immediately welcomed. She would criticize Precious's parenting decisions in front of Marcus, then express concern when Precious defended herself. She would offer advice that was clearly wrong for Ruby's temperament, then suggest that Precious's rejection of the advice showed poor judgment. Most insidiously, Eleanor began involving other family members in her campaign. Marcus's brothers received concerned phone calls about Precious's episodes. Marcus's father was told that Eleanor was worried about Ruby's safety. Even some of Eleanor's friends were recruited to provide opinions about Precious's behavior based on Eleanor's carefully curated descriptions. The isolation was systematic and effective. Within a month of setting her first boundary, Precious found herself treated as a potential threat by people who had previously welcomed her into the family. Every normal parenting decision was scrutinized for signs of mental instability. Every expression of frustration was documented as evidence of unfitness. But Precious was learning too. She began keeping detailed records of Eleanor's behavior, noting the contradictions in her stories and the manipulation tactics she used. She researched Oregon's grandparents' rights laws and learned about the legal standards for challenging custody. Most importantly, she built a support network outside of Marcus's family, reconnecting with friends and family members who could provide objective perspectives on her parenting and mental health. The early struggles were exhausting and disheartening, but they also served a purpose. Each battle taught Precious something new about the true nature of the conflict she was facing. This wasn't about postpartum depression or medication or even Eleanor's controlling personality. This was a calculated attempt to wrest control of Ruby away from her biological mother, using mental health stigma and family dynamics as weapons.
As Ruby approached her 3rd month, Precious realized that Eleanor's escalating behavior was leading towards something bigger and more dangerous than daily power struggles. The documentation, the expert consultations, the systematic undermining of her reputation within the family, these were the actions of someone preparing for war. The question was no longer whether Eleanor would make her move, but when, and whether Precious would be ready when she did.
The call came on a Tuesday morning in late April, while Precious was feeding Ruby breakfast in their sunny kitchen. She almost didn't answer when she saw the unknown number, but something made her pick up on the 4th ring. Mrs. Klein? This is Amanda Foster from Child Protective Services. We've received a report of concern regarding the welfare of your infant daughter, Ruby Klein. I need to schedule a home visit to investigate these allegations. The world seemed to tilt sideways. Precious gripped a phone tighter, watching Ruby contentedly mash banana pieces in her high chair, completely oblivious to the bombshell that had just exploded their peaceful morning. "I'm sorry, what allegations?" Precious managed to ask, her voice sounding distant to her own ears. "I can't discuss the specifics over the phone, but the report suggests possible neglect due to untreated maternal mental health issues. When would be a good time for me to come by this week?" Eleanor. It had to be Eleanor. But the audacity of actually calling CPS was beyond anything Precious had imagined, even after months of escalating manipulation. "Can you tell me who made this report?" "Anonymous reports are kept confidential, Mrs. Klein, but I do need to see you and Ruby within 48 hours. Are you available tomorrow afternoon?" Precious agreed to a 2 p.m. visit, then immediately called Marcus at work. His reaction was not what she expected. "CPS? That's really serious, Precious. They don't investigate unless there's legitimate cause for concern." "Marcus, your mother called them. Who else would do this?" "You don't know that. Maybe someone else noticed. I mean, you have been acting differently since Ruby was born." The fact that her husband's first instinct was to assume the report might be legitimate rather than to be outraged on her behalf was almost as devastating as the call itself. That afternoon, Precious drove to her parents' house in East Portland for the first time since Ruby's birth. She needed allies who knew her well enough to testify to her character if necessary. Her mother took one look at her face and pulled her into the familiar chaos of the Martinez household, where her younger brother was practicing guitar, her sister was helping their grandmother with a crossword puzzle, and the television was playing a telenovela at full volume. "Mija, what's wrong?" Maria asked, settling them at the kitchen table with coffee and homemade cookies, while Ruby dozed in her carrier. When Precious explained about the CPS call, her mother's face darkened with a fury Precious had rarely seen. "That woman," Maria spat. "I knew she was trouble from the first time I met her at your wedding. Too interested in everyone else's business. Too quick with advice nobody asked for." "But what if they find something wrong? What if they believe her story about my mental health?" Her father, Roberto, looked up from the newspaper he'd been pretending to read. "Precious, you think we don't know our own daughter? You think we can't see how good you are with that baby? That woman wants to steal your child, and she's using the government to do it." The blunt assessment was both comforting and terrifying. If her family could see Eleanor's motivations so clearly, why couldn't Marcus? The next day, Amanda Foster arrived precisely at 2 p.m. She was younger than Precious expected, probably in her early 30s, with kind eyes, but a professional demeanor that made it clear this was serious business. "I want to start by saying that most of these investigations result in unfounded determinations," Amanda said as she settled into the living room. "But I do need to ask you some direct questions about your mental health and your care of Ruby. I understand you've been resistant to taking medication for postpartum depression," Amanda said, consulting her notes. "I don't have postpartum depression," Precious replied firmly. "I was evaluated by Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a licensed psychiatrist who specializes in postpartum mental health. She determined that I'm experiencing normal adjustment challenges, not clinical depression." Amanda made notes. "Can you provide me with documentation from Dr. Walsh?" "Of course. I can call her office today." Amanda spent considerable time observing Precious's interactions with Ruby, watching feeding time, diaper changes, and play.
She examined the apartment for safety hazards, checked that Ruby's medical records were up to date, and asked detailed questions about their daily routines. Ruby appears healthy, well cared for, and appropriately bonded with you. Your home is clean and safe, and you seem very attuned to her needs. However, I do need to ask about your support system. The person who made the report expressed concern that you've been isolating yourself and Ruby from family members who want to help. Here it was, Eleanor's narrative presented as objective concern. I haven't isolated anyone, Precious said carefully. I've set boundaries with my mother-in-law because her constant criticism was affecting my confidence as a new mother. My own family sees Ruby regularly, and I have friends who visit. I'm not isolated. I'm selective about who I allow to undermine my parenting. Amanda nodded thoughtfully. Can you tell me more about these boundary issues with your mother-in-law?
Precious described Eleanor's behavior in detail, including the documentation of her concerning behaviors, the consultation with unnamed experts, and the escalation from suggesting postpartum depression to implying postpartum psychosis. Has your mother-in-law ever witnessed you harming or neglecting Ruby? Never, because I've never harmed or neglected her. Has she ever witnessed concerning behavior that might suggest mental instability? She's witnessed me being tired, frustrated with her criticism, and protective of my daughter. If those are signs of mental instability, then every new mother in America needs psychiatric intervention. Amanda spent another hour interviewing Precious about specific incidents Eleanor might have reported. It became clear that Eleanor had provided detailed accounts of their conflicts, but had framed Precious's reasonable responses as evidence of instability. What's your relationship like with your husband regarding these issues? This was the hardest question to answer, honestly. Marcus loves Eleanor deeply, and she's convinced him that her concerns about me are medically necessary. He's caught in the middle, but lately he's been siding with his mother more often than with me. After Amanda left, Precious felt emotionally drained, but cautiously optimistic. Ruby had been charming and well-behaved, their home had passed inspection, and Precious had been able to provide clear, rational responses to all questions. But Eleanor wasn't finished. 2 days later, Marcus came home with news that made Precious's blood run cold. Mom hired a lawyer, he announced without preamble. She's filing for grandparents' rights. She says she's worried that you're going to cut her out of Ruby's life completely, and she wants legal protection. Legal protection from what? From me being Ruby's mother? From your behavior. The lawyer says that if a grandparent can show that the parents are unfit or that their access to the grandchild is being unreasonably restricted, they can petition for visitation rights or even custody. The careful phrasing told Precious that Marcus had been well coached on this conversation. Eleanor wasn't just reacting to recent events. She had been planning this legal strategy for weeks, possibly months. And you support this? Marcus looked uncomfortable, but resolute. I support what's best for Ruby. If Mom gets visitation rights through the court, then we don't have to keep fighting about visits. There will be a legal structure for everyone to follow. Marcus, your mother is trying to use the courts to override my decisions as Ruby's mother. How is that what's best for Ruby? Maybe because your decisions haven't been great lately? Maybe because you need someone with more experience helping to guide those decisions. The betrayal in those words was complete. Her husband had fully accepted Eleanor's narrative that Precious was unfit to make decisions about their daughter without supervision. That evening, while Marcus was at his parents' house, discussing the legal situation, Precious called Carmen again. She actually filed? Carmen sounded shocked. That's incredibly aggressive. Most grandparents who threaten legal action are bluffing. What happens now? Now you need a lawyer, a good one. This isn't something you can handle on your own. Carmen referred her to Rebecca Martinez, no relation despite the shared surname, a family law attorney who specialized in custody disputes and grandparents' rights cases. The consultation with Rebecca was eye-opening and terrifying in equal measure. Eleanor's strategy is sophisticated, Rebecca explained after reviewing the documents Eleanor's lawyer had filed.
She's not claiming outright abuse or neglect. She's building a case that you're mentally unstable and that her involvement is necessary for Ruby's well-being. The CPS report, even if it's ultimately unfounded, gives weight to her concerns. But I'm not mentally unstable. I have documentation from Dr. Walsh confirming my mental health. That's good, but Eleanor has documentation too. She's provided the court with a detailed timeline of what she calls concerning incidents going back to Ruby's birth. She has statements from family members expressing worry about your behavior. She's even consulted with Dr. Patricia Monroe, the psychiatrist she wanted you to see, who has provided a written opinion that your refusal to take medication could indicate lack of insight into your condition. The sophistication of Eleanor's attack was breathtaking. She had anticipated every possible defense and had prepared counterarguments backed by professional opinions and family testimony. What are my chances? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. In Oregon, the standard for granting grandparents' rights is high. Eleanor has to prove either that you're unfit or that Ruby's best interests require her involvement. Based on what I'm seeing, she probably can't meet the unfitness standard, but best interests? That's more subjective, especially if your husband testifies in her favor. He wouldn't do that. Rebecca's expression was grim. Based on the preliminary filings, he's already provided a statement supporting Eleanor's petition. I'm sorry, Precious. I know this is hard to hear. The document Rebecca showed me felt like reading about strangers. Marcus had described Precious as increasingly isolated and defensive, resistant to helpful guidance, and unwilling to consider professional treatment for obvious mental health challenges. He had expressed concern for Ruby's well-being and support for Eleanor's reasonable request for guaranteed visitation. Walking to her car after the consultation, Precious felt like moving through a nightmare. In the space of a few months, she had gone from being a new mother learning to navigate parenthood to being portrayed as a mentally unstable woman whose own husband questioned her fitness to care for their child. But as she sat in the parking lot holding the legal documents that would determine Ruby's future, something hardened inside her. Eleanor had escalated this conflict beyond family drama into a legal battle, complete with professional opinions, documented evidence, and court filings. If Eleanor wanted a war, Precious would give her one. But this time, Precious would be fighting with her own weapons: truth, professional validation of her mental health, and the unshakable certainty that no one, not Eleanor, not Marcus, not even the courts, had more right than she did to determine what was best for her daughter. The real battle was just beginning.
The emergency custody hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. on a gray Friday in mid-May, exactly 6 weeks after Eleanor's initial petition. Precious had barely slept the night before, not because Ruby was fussing. At 4 months old, she was finally sleeping through the night, but because everything hung in the balance of what would happen in Judge Patricia Hendrick's courtroom that morning. The call from Rebecca had come at 6 p.m. the previous day, just as Precious was giving Ruby her evening bath. Eleanor's lawyer filed an emergency motion, Rebecca had said without preamble. They're claiming that your recent behavior constitutes an immediate threat to Ruby's well-being, and they want temporary custody transferred to Eleanor pending the full hearing. The words had hit Precious like a physical blow. What recent behavior? I haven't done anything different. According to their filing, you've been observed having emotional outbursts in public, you've made irrational accusations against Eleanor, and most seriously, you've been coaching Ruby to reject her grandmother's affection. The last accusation would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. Ruby was 4 months old, barely capable of sitting up unassisted, let alone being coached to reject anyone. Rebecca, Ruby doesn't even have object permanence yet. How could I possibly coach her to reject Eleanor? I know it sounds absurd, but Eleanor has video evidence of Ruby crying when Eleanor tries to hold her, and she's brought in Dr. Monroe to testify that this could indicate parental alienation beginning in infancy. That night, Marcus had packed a bag and left for his parents' house without a word of explanation. His departure felt like the final piece of evidence Eleanor needed. Even Ruby's own father couldn't bear to stay in the same house with her allegedly unstable mother. Now, sitting in the courthouse waiting room with Ruby sleeping peacefully in her carrier, Precious watched Eleanor arrive with an entourage that looked like a small army. There was Eleanor herself, composed and perfectly dressed in a navy suit that suggested gravitas and respectability. Behind her came Marcus, avoiding Precious's eyes, followed by Eleanor's lawyer, Dr. Monroe, and two people Precious didn't recognize, but who carried themselves with the authority of expert witnesses. Those are Dr. Patricia Monroe and Dr. David Chen, Rebecca explained quietly. Monroe is the psychiatrist Eleanor consulted about your refusal to take medication. Chen is a child psychologist who's going to testify about the potential long-term effects of parental alienation on infants. But I haven't alienated Ruby from anyone. She cries with Eleanor because Eleanor makes her nervous with all the grabbing and loud talking. I know, but we need to prove that, and infant behavior is very subjective. A 4-month-old can't testify about her own preferences. Judge Hendricks was a woman in her late 50s with silver hair and the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that suggested she had seen every possible variation of family drama. She listened impassionedly as Eleanor's lawyer, Michael Torres, presented their case for emergency custody. Your Honor, we have a pattern of increasingly concerning behavior from the respondent mother. Mrs. Klein has refused medically recommended treatment for postpartum mental health issues, has isolated herself and the child from supportive family members, and has become demonstrating signs of parental alienation syndrome. Torres presented Eleanor's documented timeline of concerning incidents, starting with Precious crying during Ruby's first week home and culminating with her recent aggressive confrontations when Eleanor tried to visit. Each incident was presented with clinical language that stripped away context and made normal reactions to a controlling mother-in-law sound like symptoms of mental illness. We have expert testimony from Dr. Patricia Monroe, who has evaluated Mrs. Klein's behavioral patterns and determined that her refusal to accept treatment represents a lack of insight that could be dangerous to the child's psychological development. Dr. Monroe, Torres continued, in your professional opinion, what are the risks of leaving a 4-month-old infant in the care of a mother who refuses treatment for postpartum mental health issues? The risks are significant and well documented. Untreated postpartum depression can lead to impaired bonding, inconsistent caregiving, and, in severe cases, harm to the child. Mrs. Klein's resistance to professional intervention suggests she may lack the insight necessary to recognize when her condition is affecting her parenting. And what about the reported signs of parental alienation? Dr. Monroe leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on the tone of someone delivering grave news. Parental alienation can begin very early, even in infancy. If the mother is consistently presenting her mother-in-law as a threat or source of stress, the infant will begin to absorb that anxiety and reject the grandmother's attempts at bonding. This can have lifelong consequences for the child's ability to form healthy relationships. When Rebecca stood to cross-examine Dr. Monroe, Precious could see the uphill battle they were facing. Dr. Monroe, you've never actually examined my client, is that correct? That's correct. Mrs. Klein refused to schedule an appointment with me. So your opinion is entirely based on secondhand reports from Mrs. Eleanor Klein. I have reviewed extensive documentation of concerning behaviors, statements from family members, and consultation notes from other professionals, including Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who actually did examine my client. Dr. Walsh's evaluation was limited to a single session focused specifically on ruling out major depressive disorder. A comprehensive assessment of postpartum mental health requires multiple sessions and consideration of family dynamics. Rebecca pressed on, but Dr. Walsh is a licensed psychiatrist who specializes in postpartum mental health, correct? Yes, but... And she found no evidence of postpartum depression or any other mental health condition that would impair my client's parenting. Yes, based on her limited assessment, but as I stated, a single session is insufficient for ruling out more subtle forms of postpartum mood disorders. The back and forth continued for another 20 minutes, with Dr. Monroe defending her diagnosis of a patient she never met, while Rebecca tried to highlight the problems with such an approach. But Precious could see from Judge Hendricks's expression that the doctor's credentials and confident presentation were having an impact. Things got worse when Dr. Chen took the stand to discuss parental alienation. He presented Ruby's apparent discomfort with Eleanor as evidence of systematic psychological manipulation, using language that made Precious sound like an abusive parent rather than a protective mother.
Infants are highly sensitive to their primary caregiver's emotional state, Dr. Chen testified. If the mother consistently becomes tense, angry, or defensive when a particular person approaches, the infant will mirror that response and begin to reject that person's attempts at interaction. In your opinion, Dr. Chen, what would be the appropriate intervention in this situation? The child should be temporarily placed in a neutral environment where she can develop a relationship with her grandmother without the interference of the mother's anxiety and hostility. This would allow us to determine whether the infant's rejection is based on legitimate comfort issues or learned responses to maternal hostility. The neutral environment Dr. Chen was describing was Eleanor's house. The intervention he was recommending was removing Ruby from her mother's care and placing her with the woman who had orchestrated this entire situation. When Marcus took the stand, Precious felt her heart break completely. This was the man she had married, the man who had promised to love and protect her, and he was about to testify against her as a fitness as a mother. Mr. Klein, can you describe your wife's behavior since your daughter's birth? Marcus spoke in a monotone, as if reciting a script he had memorized. She's become increasingly defensive and suspicious. She interprets my mother's helpful suggestions as personal attacks. She's isolated herself and Ruby from family members who want to be involved, and she's refused to consider treatment that might help her manage her emotions better.
Are you concerned about your wife's ability to care for Ruby? Marcus answered so long that the court reporter looked up from her machine. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. I'm concerned about her judgment. I'm concerned that her mental state is affecting her ability to make good decisions about Ruby's care. Do you support your mother's petition for visitation rights? Yes. I think Ruby needs the stability and experience my mother can provide. I think supervised visits would be good for everyone. The word supervised hit Precious like a slap. Marcus wasn't just supporting Eleanor's right to see Ruby. He was supporting the implication that Precious couldn't be trusted alone with her own daughter. When Rebecca tried to cross-examine Marcus, he stuck to his script with the determination of someone who had been thoroughly coached. Mr. Klein, has your wife ever harmed Ruby in any way? No. Has she ever neglected Ruby's physical needs? No. Is Ruby healthy, well cared for, and meeting all her developmental milestones? Yes. Then what specific aspect of your wife's caregiving concerns you? Marcus looked toward his mother before answering. It's not about the day-to-day care. It's about her emotional stability and her resistance to getting help when she clearly needs it. By the time Rebecca called Dr. Walsh to testify on Precious's behalf, the damage felt irreversible. Dr. Walsh was professional and credible, explaining her evaluation of Precious and her conclusion that no mental health treatment was necessary. In my professional opinion, Mrs. Klein is experiencing normal adjustment challenges associated with new motherhood. Her protective responses regarding her infant daughter are appropriate and healthy. Her resistance to unnecessary medication shows good judgment, not lack of insight. But Torres's cross-examination was brutal. Dr. Walsh, how many sessions did you have with Mrs. Klein? One comprehensive evaluation session. And you determined that one session was sufficient to rule out all forms of postpartum mental health issues? I determined that she didn't meet the criteria for postpartum depression or anxiety disorders. If she had shown signs of other conditions, I would have recommended follow-up sessions. But you didn't recommend follow-up sessions to monitor her ongoing adjustment? Dr. Walsh hesitated. I told her she could return if she felt she needed additional support. So you left it up to someone you were evaluating for mental health issues to determine whether she needed continued monitoring? The implication was clear. Even Precious's own psychiatrist hadn't been thorough enough in her evaluation. When Judge Hendricks called for a recess before making her decision, Precious sat in the hallway holding Ruby and trying not to cry. Everything felt hopeless. Eleanor had come prepared with expert witnesses, detailed documentation, and even Marcus's testimony supporting her case. Precious had one psychiatric evaluation and her insistence that she was a good mother.
What happens if she grants temporary custody to Eleanor? Precious asked Rebecca. Ruby would go home with Eleanor today. You'd get supervised visits while we prepare for the full hearing. The thought of Eleanor carrying Ruby out of the courthouse, of going home to an empty apartment while her daughter slept in Eleanor's house, was unbearable. And what are the chances she'll rule in Eleanor's favor? Rebecca was quiet for a long moment. Higher than I'd like. Eleanor's team has presented a very compelling case, and they have professional backing for their concerns. Plus, temporary custody in emergency situations has a lower standard of proof than permanent custody. She doesn't have to prove you're unfit, just that there's enough concern to warrant protective measures while we sort things out. When they returned to the courtroom, Judge Hendricks delivered her ruling with the same dispassionate tone she had used throughout the hearing. While I find no evidence of abuse or severe neglect, I am concerned by the pattern of behavior described by the petitioner and the professional opinions presented regarding the respondent's mental health and judgment. Given the age of the child and the potential risks involved, I am granting temporary custody to Eleanor Klein pending a full evidentiary hearing in 30 days. The words seemed to echo from a great distance. Precious felt Rebecca's hand on her arm, heard Ruby making soft baby noises in her carrier, saw Eleanor's smile of triumph across the courtroom. "Mrs. Klein," the judge continued, "you will have supervised visitation with your daughter 3 times per week for 2 hours each visit. The supervisor will be appointed by the court. You are also ordered to undergo a comprehensive psychological evaluation by a court-appointed psychiatrist." And just like that, it was over. 4 months of motherhood ended by a judge's gavel and Eleanor's systematic campaign to prove her unfit. As Eleanor approached to collect Ruby, Precious felt something inside her shatter completely. This was the crisis point, the moment when everything she had fought to protect was taken away, when the system that was supposed to protect families was used as a weapon against them. But as she handed her daughter to Eleanor, she made a silent promise. This wasn't the end of the story. This was the moment when she would discover exactly how far a mother would go to fight for her child.
The supervised visitation center smelled like industrial disinfectant and broken dreams. Room 3B was painted in cheerful yellow with cartoon animals on the walls, a futile attempt to mask the institutional reality that families only ended up here when the state had decided they couldn't be trusted alone together. Precious sat on a small plastic chair designed for children, watching Ruby play with blocks under the watchful eye of Janet Morrison, the court-appointed supervisor who documented every interaction between mother and daughter. Every smile, every tear, every moment of connection with her own daughter was scrutinized and recorded by Janet, whose notes would be submitted to the court as evidence of Precious's fitness for motherhood. "She seems comfortable with you," Janet observed as Ruby crawled toward Precious with a delighted squeal. At 6 months old, Ruby was hitting all her developmental milestones, but Precious could see subtle changes that broke her heart. Ruby was more hesitant now, less immediately trusting. Living with Eleanor's rigid schedule and constant supervision had made her more cautious, more aware that adult attention came with conditions and expectations. "She's my daughter," Precious replied, lifting Ruby into her lap for what felt like the 1,000th time that day. "Of course she's comfortable with me." But even as she said it, Precious wondered if that would remain true. How long could their bond survive being rationed out in 2-hour increments under fluorescent lights? The breakthrough began with an unexpected phone call on a Wednesday evening. Precious was sitting in her empty apartment, staring at Ruby's unused high chair, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. "Mrs. Klein? This is Sarah Chen. I'm a pediatric nurse at OHSU. I hope you don't mind me calling, but I've been following your situation and I think there's something you need to know about your mother-in-law." Precious's heart began to race. "What do you mean, following my situation?"
Eleanor Klein brought Ruby to our emergency department last weekend. She claimed the baby had been acting lethargic and refusing to eat. We ran a full workup, blood tests, imaging, everything. Ruby was completely healthy, just going through a normal sleep regression that most 6-month-olds experience. Why are you telling me this? Sarah's voice dropped to a whisper. Because this is the 3rd time Eleanor has brought Ruby in for emergencies that turned out to be normal baby behavior. And because I remembered your case from the news coverage, I think she's building a medical record to support her custody petition. The news coverage. Precious had tried to avoid reading about her own case, but she knew that Eleanor's lawyer had been strategic about media outreach. The story had been framed as a concerned grandmother fighting to protect her grandchild from an unstable mother. Exactly the narrative Eleanor had been crafting for months. What kind of medical record? Emergency room visits create documentation of failure to thrive concerns, feeding issues, developmental problems, all the things that might suggest inadequate mothering. The doctors who see Ruby don't know the context. They just see a grandmother bringing in a baby with concerning symptoms, and they document what they observe. After Sarah hung up, Precious sat in the dark and felt something shift inside her. For months, she had been playing defense, responding to Eleanor's attacks and trying to prove her innocence. But Eleanor was still actively working to build her case, creating new evidence while Ruby was in her care. It was time to go on offense. The next morning, Precious called Rebecca with a clarity she hadn't felt since this nightmare began. "I want to hire a private investigator," she announced. "I want to know everything about Eleanor's background, her previous relationships with her other daughters-in-law, her medical history, her financial situation, everything." "Precious, that's expensive, and I'm not sure what we'd find that would be relevant to..." "Precious, she's taking Ruby to the emergency room to create fake medical crises. She's systematically documenting problems that don't exist. If she's doing that now, what else has she done? What else is she capable of?" The private investigator was a woman named Linda Torres, no relation to Eleanor's lawyer, who specialized in family law cases. Within a week, Linda had uncovered information that changed everything. Eleanor Klein has a pattern, Linda explained during their meeting in Rebecca's office. She's done this before with her oldest son's ex-wife. In 2018, she filed for custody of her grandson after his parents divorced. She documented concerning behaviors, brought in expert witnesses, claimed the mother was mentally unstable. What happened in that case? She won. The ex-wife, Jessica Klein, lost primary custody and moved to California. Eleanor raised the boy for 2 years before the father remarried and reclaimed custody. But here's the interesting part. Jessica Klein is willing to testify about Eleanor's methods. The conversation with Jessica Klein took place over video call, and it was like looking into a crystal ball of what Precious's future might hold if Eleanor succeeded. "She isolated me from my own son by making every normal parenting decision seem like evidence of my unfitness," Jessica explained. "She documented everything, times when Tommy cried, when he didn't want to eat her cooking, when he reached for me instead of her. She turned those normal moments into proof that I was damaging him psychologically." But how did she convince the court? Jessica's laugh was bare. "Same way she's convincing them about you. Expert witnesses who never met me but were willing to diagnose me based on her reports. Family members who testified that I seemed different after the divorce. A systematic campaign to make my natural responses to her interference look like mental illness." What ended it? Eleanor overplayed her hand. She kept bringing Tommy to doctors for problems that didn't exist, kept documenting new concerns even after she had custody. Finally, one of the pediatricians got suspicious and reported her for possible medical abuse of a child. That's when my ex-husband realized what his mother had done and fought to get Tommy back. The medical abuse angle was the breakthrough Precious had been looking for. Linda's investigation revealed that Eleanor had a pattern of seeking excessive medical attention for children in her care, creating paper trails that suggested health problems where none existed. She's not just doing this to build legal cases, Linda explained. She's genuinely believes she can diagnose and treat problems that medical professionals miss. She sees herself as the expert on child welfare, and anyone who disagrees with her assessments is either incompetent or negligent. Armed with this new information, Rebecca petitioned for an emergency hearing to modify the custody arrangement. She presented evidence of Eleanor's pattern of behavior, Jessica Klein's testimony, and the concerning reports from OHSU about unnecessary medical visits. But the most powerful evidence came from an unexpected source: Marcus himself. 3 days before the scheduled hearing, Marcus appeared at Precious's apartment. He looked haggard, like he hadn't slept in weeks, and his eyes were red from crying. "She won't let me be alone with Ruby," he said without preamble. "My own daughter. She says I don't know how to read her cues properly, that I might miss signs of distress or illness." Precious stepped aside to let him in, and they sat on opposite ends of the couch where they had once planned their future together. "She's documenting everything. I do too," Marcus continued. "Every time I feed Ruby, every diaper change, every moment when Ruby cries or seems fussy. She says it's to protect Ruby, but I think she's building a case against me too."
Marcus, why are you telling me this now? He looked at her with an expression of devastation and dawning understanding. "Because I realize that if she's willing to do this to me, her own son, then everything you said about her behavior toward you was probably true. I've been so focused on believing she was trying to help that I couldn't see she was trying to control." The conversation that followed was the most honest they'd had since Ruby's birth. Marcus described months of his mother's escalating control, her criticism of his parenting, her insistence that both he and Precious needed her guidance to raise their daughter properly. He admitted that he had provided testimony supporting Eleanor's petition because she had convinced him it was the only way to maintain his relationship with his daughter. "She told me that if I didn't support her legal case, you might try to keep Ruby away from the family completely. She made it sound like I had to choose between you and my daughter. And you chose your mother." "I chose what I thought would keep Ruby safe. But I was wrong. She's not trying to protect Ruby, she's trying to possess her." 2 days later, Marcus took the stand in Judge Hendrick's courtroom and recanted his previous testimony. "Your Honor, I need to correct statements I made during the emergency custody hearing," he began, his voice shaking but determined. "I testified that I was concerned about my wife's mental health and judgment. That testimony was based on my mother's interpretations of my wife's behavior, not on my own observations." Eleanor's lawyer objected strenuously, but Judge Hendricks allowed Marcus to continue. "Since Ruby has been living with my mother, I've seen the same controlling behavior directed at me that my wife tried to tell me about. My mother documents and critiques every interaction I have with my daughter. She's taken Ruby to the emergency room 3 times for problems that turned out to be normal baby behavior, and she's made it clear that she considers both my wife and me to be inadequate parents who need her supervision." The rest of the hearing unfolded like a revelation. Jessica Klein testified about Eleanor's previous custody grab. Linda Torres presented evidence of Eleanor's pattern of behavior across multiple family situations. Dr. Walsh testified again, this time with additional documentation supporting her assessment of Precious's mental health. Most damaging to Eleanor's case was the testimony from Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the OHSU pediatrician who had treated Ruby during Eleanor's manufactured medical emergencies. "In my opinion, these repeated emergency visits for non-existent problems represent a form of medical abuse," Dr. Rodriguez testified. "The child is being subjected to unnecessary medical procedures and interventions based on an adult's inability to distinguish between normal infant behavior and genuine medical concerns."
When Eleanor took the stand in her own defense, her composure finally cracked under Rebecca's cross-examination. Mrs. Klein, you've testified that you documented Precious's concerning behaviors to protect Ruby, but you've also documented concerns about your son Marcus's parenting, haven't you? Marcus is inexperienced. He needs guidance. And Jessica Klein, your former daughter-in-law, also needed guidance? She was clearly unstable after her divorce. Mrs. Klein, is it possible that every mother and father in your family needs your guidance because you don't believe anyone else is capable of making proper decisions about children? Eleanor's answer was telling. I have more experience than any of them. I've raised 3 successful children. I know what works and what doesn't. So you believe you should have decision-making authority over all the grandchildren in your family? I believe I should have input when I see problems that others are too inexperienced or too emotionally involved to recognize. Judge Hendrick's ruling was swift and decisive. After reviewing all the evidence presented, I find that the original emergency custody order was based on incomplete information and expert testimony that has since been called into question. Mrs. Eleanor Klein's pattern of behavior toward multiple family members suggests a concerning need to control rather than a legitimate concern for child welfare. Ruby Klein is hereby returned to the primary custody of her parents, Marcus and Precious Klein, effective immediately. Mrs. Eleanor Klein's petition for grandparents' rights is denied. Furthermore, any future contact between Mrs. Eleanor Klein and the minor child must be supervised and approved by both parents. As the judge's gavel fell, Precious felt a rush of emotion so intense she could barely remain standing. Across the courtroom, Eleanor sat in stunned silence, finally understanding that her carefully constructed campaign had not only failed, but had exposed her true motives to legal scrutiny. Marcus reached for Precious's hand as they left the courthouse together, Ruby sleeping peacefully in her carrier between them. They had a long road ahead, rebuilding their marriage, establishing new boundaries with Eleanor, and helping Ruby readjust to life with her parents. But for the first time in months, they were walking forward as a family. The real victory wasn't just winning the legal battle. It was the moment when Marcus finally saw Eleanor's behavior for what it really was, when the court system recognized manipulation disguised as concern, and when a community of women who had faced similar battles came forward to support each other. Eleanor's final weapon, Precious's refusal to take medication for a condition she didn't have, had ultimately become the thread that unraveled her entire case. Because when the court-appointed psychiatrist, Dr. Michael Torres, finally evaluated Precious for himself, he came to the same conclusion Dr. Walsh had reached months earlier. Mrs. Klein shows no signs of postpartum depression, anxiety, or any other mental health condition that would impair her parenting abilities, Dr. Torres reported to the court. Her refusal to accept medication for a condition she doesn't have demonstrates appropriate self-advocacy and good judgment, not lack of insight. In the end, the truth was simple. Sometimes the most loving thing a mother can do is say no to those who claim to know better than she does what her child needs. And sometimes the system works, when enough people are brave enough to speak the truth about what they've witnessed and experienced. As they drove home from the courthouse with Ruby babbling happily in her car seat, Precious realized that Eleanor had inadvertently given her the greatest gift possible: absolute certainty and her own judgment as a mother, and the knowledge that no one's love for Ruby could ever be greater than her own.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.